Hello, ladies and gentlemen, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today I'm going to be returning to a game that I haven't touched in several months, and that game is Order of Battle Pacific. I am resuming my Let's Play campaign where we had just won the Battle of Coral Sea, and we are moving on to the Battle of Midway. Now, in the original battle or the attack on Pearl Harbor, we sank all the American battleships, and in the Battle of Coral Sea, we sank all the American carriers. So, those two little red pins on the map there represent those two carryover effects that are carrying over to this particular fight. So, again, we'll be fighting the Battle of Midway. So far, we've won every battle with a major victory. I don't think you could advance in any of the previous battles in anything but a victory. I'm not sure once we get to Midway. Coral Sea kind of was a historic Japanese defeat, but not dramatically so, and Midway was definitely a massive Japanese defeat. So I'm not sure if, now that we're on to some of the battles that Japan lost, if we lose, if we're still able to proceed. I guess we may or may not find out, depending on how we do here. So you can see here on the map, we've got the briefing here. We need to take Midway Island. We need to take Sandsland Island and Eastern Island. I guess Midway split into two small islands, one with the runway, one without. We need to take both those islands. That's our principal objective in this fight. Let's see here. We've got a troop convoy to the southwest of Midway with some warships in escort. And then if we move to the north, kind of northwest a bit, we've got our carrier fleet, which you can see here we have some generic ships. It looks like at least two carriers here on the map that we start with that are already given to us just as part of the fight. But then we also have our core units as well. You can see their objectives here are to capture Midway Island, rout or destroy the enemy fleet, and then we have some secondary objectives to destroy all enemy carriers, destroy 10 warships, not to lose any troop transports, and I didn't see the rest. But we'll go ahead here and deploy our carriers kind of in the same area that the carriers we start with are deployed. We'll also deploy the Yamato, the Megami, and our other chief surface vessels in the same area, and then we'll of course deploy our air units off of these carriers as well. Now, my general strategy, I'm going to set up a line of pickets, if you will, of air scouts in front of the carrier fleet, and hopefully we can sweep in front of our carrier force, because historically the Japanese were surprised by the American carrier force's presence at Midway. The idea at the Battle of Midway was to lure the Americans into a decisive engagement. The thought was when the Japanese carriers bombed Midway, it would prompt a American response, and the carriers would rush out of Hawaii and attempt to defeat the Japanese carrier fleet. But they would be caught in an ambush. Basically, the Japanese would bomb Midway and then would wait for the Americans to show up and ambush them. However, the Americans actually got wind of the Japanese plan thanks to superior intelligence and code breaking that allowed the Americans to intercept the Japanese radio messages talking about the operation. And so the Americans actually were the ones waiting in ambush at the Battle of Midway. And the rest, as they say, is history. The Japanese flew a initial strike at Midway as they were approaching the island, did some heavy damage to the island, and then were preparing a second strike when they got some word of an American carrier fleet as well. And I'm simplifying, there were a few other steps in this process. But then they got word that the American carrier fleet had been sighted, so then they started switching arming, and as these aircraft were in the midst of refueling and rearming, American aircraft had already been launched from the American carrier fleet and sailed in or flew in and devastated the Japanese. They hit all four major Japanese flat tops. All four had been part of the Battle of part of the attack on Pearl Harbor. They were 4 of the 6 Japanese fleet's principal carriers, and they were set afire, and the weapons and fuel that was all laying about as a result of the rearming caught fire. American dive bombers came in and dropped bombs that penetrated through the Japanese deck and exploded underneath the deck on the ammo decks and the magazines and the basically the hangars where the planes were being rearmed, and all this ammo and fuel lying about basically served as kindling for the bombs and set these carriers ablaze. The Japanese didn't have the same level of damage control as the American fleet did. So, it's interesting if you look at the Battle of Coral Sea, where the U.S. lost, I believe it was the Lexington, to a similar sort of situation where a dive bomber's bomb penetrated the deck, detonated below deck, and then started some fires that were uncontrollable. The American damage control parties did a much better job, but there were some leaks that sprung up in the fuel tanks that basically meant there was a cascading series of explosions that no one could do anything about. In the Japanese case, that's not what happened. In the Japanese case, it was just poor discipline on, sort of maintaining appropriate safety standards for their bombs and their fuel lines. But even so, the Japanese damage control parties were just not up to the same standard as the Americans, and that would be something that would be evident throughout the war. But anyway, so the Japanese were able to launch a counterstrike, and there were actually a couple of American raids on the fleet. The first raid, I think, put 3 ablaze, and the fourth wasn't until later in the day, and the Japanese managed to get a strike off against the American carriers and sank the Yorktown, but still 4 carriers to 1 ended up being a pretty decisive defeat for the Japanese, and really was kind of marked the traditional turning point of World War II, where the Japanese went from having a superior carrier force to having, for a while, a carrier force that was on par with the Americans, largely as the 2 surviving Japanese. The Americans only had about 2 of their own carriers in region, or 2 or 3. So during the Guadalcanal campaign, there was pretty equal distribution of forces in terms of carriers and whatnot. But basically, it was at this point where the Japanese lost so many of their carriers that would have been vital. If the Japanese still had those carriers and those air crews in early to mid 43, as the American Essex class started coming online, it's possible the Japanese could have done more to withstand the initial American advances. But by the time that happened, the Japanese Navy had been so attrited, the carrier fleet had been more or less destroyed, at least at that time. The Japanese would rebuild it somewhat. But it had been so destroyed that there was really no hope of any kind of equal footing, equal fighting. So it's interesting, because if you look at Coral Sea and you look at Midway and you look at some of the operations early in the war, there really is a sort of a back and forth and undetermined nature that goes with a lot of these fights, a lot of nail biting, a lot of uncertainty, a fairly a fleet distribution that, at least in terms of the way the battles played out, had a fair bit of parity. When you go past Midway, everything becomes well, not Midway, but when you go past the Guadalcanal campaign after Midway, everything really becomes fairly decisive in the American side. And if the Japanese had 3 or 4 more carriers, that decisive period still would have come when the Americans began cranking out Essex easily. But they only built 6 Essex in 1943, so it's certainly possible that the Japanese could have slowed down the American advance much more if they had those carriers still in force. It would have delayed the American counterstrokes. But anyway, just me kind of rambling about the Battle of Midway. You can see here I'm kind of trying to consolidate my force. I'm bringing some of these ships up north and kind of creating just a massive blob of ships for my fleet. The idea is we can provide kind of joint air support, anti-air support. So if the Americans do attack our fleet, we've got more anti-aircraft guns to deal with them, because those ships do have anti-aircraft guns, but they have a limited radius, a limited range that they can fire and be effective at. Additionally, we need to set up some screens of destroyers and attempt to detect for submarines. That's what I'm doing right here. But this is the southern flotilla, so one major concern I have is making sure that we don't get those guys destroyed, because we need them in order to take Midway as well. You can see we're advancing our carrier screen out, or not carrier, but we're advancing our recon screen. I guess I'll wait till the turn is over to talk about that here. And you can see there's some American B-17s that are attacking our shipping here. You can see, looks like some American bombers. First strike. So again, there's a special event that plays, basically telling us that the Americans have surprised us and are moving in to attack our carrier fleet. There you can see an American dive bomber unit. Fortunately, we've got our fighters up, so we should be able to move to intercept and hopefully destroy them before they get any kind of progress to the fleet. Additionally, you can see these little green aircraft here set up a kind of a picket line, if you will, of scouting aircraft that I'm going to continue moving in advance of our carriers. I haven't lit off all my attack aircraft yet just because they have limited range. So the thought is, wait, keep them on board the ships until the enemy ships are spotted and then launch them. Although I do have a general idea. Historically, the American fleet deployed northeast of Midway with their carriers. So I do have a general sense of the location of the Americans, assuming things are playing out the way they did historically. If they don't, I have no idea, and I'm probably wasting my time. But I assume that they do have a similar play to the way that history happened. So again, I assume if I keep moving my scouts to the east, just kind of straight east, we'll start detecting these American task forces that would have the carriers we are looking for. You can see there, it looks like there's a lot more air units inbound, so we're going to need to get the rest of our zeros into play here. If we don't, we risk starting to lose some of our carriers, and that's obviously not something that's acceptable. Meanwhile, the bombers that we have, there's a couple of non-core bombers that we have that were already inbound to Midway Island. We're going to divert those north now that we have some enemy ships that are detected. Not sure if they're carriers or not, but we've at the very least detected an enemy destroyer screen in front of them. It helps to know that historically the American fleet hid to the northeast of Midway, and that's where I'm sending my reconnaissance forces, kind of using history in a gamey sort of artificial way, but it may help us, and so I'm going to go ahead and do it. So with that said, and with my whole setup more or less done, I'm just sort of, so you're aware, if you haven't already caught on, I'm shamelessly using history as a advantage. I'm using history in a very gamey sort of way to try and help the Japanese win the Battle of Midway and hopefully not lose a defeat in the Battle of Midway. Now, one thing I did want to talk about, this is the video that covers this battle in Order of Battle Pacific will probably be 3 separate videos. So we'll probably be looking at maybe 3 or maybe 4. It depends how long it takes to play. That's a 30-turn battle here, you can see, so it could be a little bit longer, could be a little bit shorter, but basically as we go through and we play this series, there was one topic I wanted to talk about. I've kind of done the setup for the game, and I'll add different caveats or different comments as we fight our way through the fight. That was redundant. Anyway, as we fight our way through the battle. But I did want to talk about a book that I just finished reading called Pacific Crucible, and that book is written by Ian Toll. It's the first part in a 3-part series that will look at the entire Second World War in the Pacific, and starts with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Pacific Crucible covers the sort of pre-wartime period all the way through the early parts of the war, Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and then finishes up with the Battle of Midway, and then the second book, Something Tide, covers that point on. I may have talked about the book a little bit in one of my previous videos. To be honest, I can't quite remember. I did a little bit of digging and didn't find it. I know it's a topic I wanted to talk about a bit. It's actually a pretty good book. It's kind of a high-level overview of the early days of World War II, as well as the sort of pre-World War II period. It talks about Alfred Thayer Mahan's book on the influence of sea power upon history, and sort of the influence that had on the American Navy. Basically, the book called for the decisive sea battle to win a war in an afternoon, and the book discusses kind of the ways the American fleet was shaped, and how these doctrines put forth by Alfred Thayer Mahan had a significant impact not just on the United States but also on the world stage, including Japan, and how everyone kind of thought about the decisive naval engagement as the way to win a war. The book goes on from talking about Alfred Thayer Mahan to talking about sort of the early history of the 20th century. It talks about the Russo-Japanese War and kind of the influence that had on Japanese culture. It also talks about how the American press, American racism, and the attempt by Teddy Roosevelt to negotiate an end to the Russo-Japanese War, a negotiation that really the Japanese felt like they were betrayed, and that the Americans kind of stole a lot of their loot that they should have gained from this conflict. They didn't gain it because the Americans intervened, basically, in their eyes, on the side of Russia. It goes on to talk about all those different sorts of things and how Anglo-Japanese relations began to become strained, again, because the American insistence on the peace treaty in the Russo-Japanese War wasn't as favorable as the Japanese would have liked for themselves. And the book also talks about an interesting situation that had developed in the early 1900s. It first references kind of Theodore Roosevelt's admiration of the Japanese people and the way that Japan is modernizing itself and turning itself into a superpower in the early 1900s. So it kind of paints this picture of Roosevelt as being a very pro-Japanese president, which in many ways he was, but it also shows sort of the growing hyper-nationalism that was beginning to take hold in Japan as Japan began to modernize itself, as Japan began to flex its military might. The people in Japan became increasingly militaristic. And the government, actually probably more accurately, the government became increasingly militaristic, and the parliamentary system, which was in place, began to lose power. But it talks about a key event in Japanese-American relations in the early 1900s when there was a firestorm that erupted over American schools deciding to segregate Japanese immigrants or even American citizens of Japanese descent out of schools in California. So basically they refused to allow Japanese students to be in the same schools, and there were several articles about it, and it inflamed the Japanese public. Theodore Roosevelt was aghast at the situation and, was trying to hope that things would smooth over, but the Japanese were highly offended. And it's interesting that American racism at the time really helped to begin the souring of relations, which had been somewhat cordial before that, and things began to slide down. It also details the decline and eventual fall of the traditional sort of parliamentary system in the Japanese government. It kind of talks about some treaties that were signed between the U.S. and the Japanese, and how sometimes the leaders recognized treaties as being necessary, but the Japanese people did not, the Japanese newspapers did not, and as a result, you saw times where treaties would be signed and you would think, okay, things are going well, these nations are starting to work together, but unfortunately, the reality was that while the politicians recognized some of these treaties, like the Washington Naval Treaties, may have been political necessities, the paper and the journalists didn't see them the same way, and viewed them as, again, proof of the Americans' desire to meddle in Japanese affairs. And again, as I've already mentioned, the Japanese also see their parliamentary system slowly but surely lose power. Parliamentarians who speak out against the military are silenced, and over a couple of decades, the Japanese parliament goes from being an open body that's running Japan to basically a rubber stamp for the Imperial Japanese military, which begins infighting amongst itself, the Army and the Navy fighting against each other for resources, and also really struggling to cooperate in military operations as well. And the book does a good job of detailing how that struggle resulted. One of the things that really impressed me with the book was the way it kind of talked about its characters. It's a great biography of several major characters. It has a very strong one of Yamato, who I think most casual observers of World War II tend to think of General Isiro, and I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation of that name, Yamato, the commander of the Japanese fleet, as being a very good commander, someone who was a visionary, had tremendous success, and was killed during the war, and that was a huge blow to the Japanese. And there's no doubt that it was a big blow to the Japanese. There's also no doubt that he did very well in his plan on the attack on Pearl Harbor. But it's interesting because if you look at his actual military record, a lot of the operations that he plans do not go off all that well. Now, he's the senior commander. He's not handling the day-to-day operations. But still, it's interesting to read through that biography of the man in this book, and you at the very least have to recognize that he is not the character or the quality in terms of the officer as we traditionally think. That doesn't mean he was a bad admiral by any chance. I wouldn't suggest that at all. It just means that perhaps he was not the Erwin Rommel of the Pacific that we tend to think of him as. One of the shortcomings that I felt the book had, and there's several other, by the way, very strong biographies that are told in the book. It also does a really good job of explaining the sort of code breakers under magic, I believe it was called, that really helped to turn the tide and helped to, make the Battle of Midway possible. But the book also, in addition to having very strong biographies, and telling a bit about some of the infighting between the different code-breaking groups, and actually how after Midway, Rochefort was kind of shunted off to the side because of political infighting. The book also has one glaring weakness, I would say, at least in my eyes, and that's that the book really washes over the early part of the war. It goes through great detail on Pearl Harbor. It also goes through great detail on the Battle of Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway. It describes both those battles very well, their impact, their influence, and kind of how the fight went down in very well written prose. But what I would say is the book does a very poor job, in my mind, of kind of talking about the Japanese conquest before Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea. It's really of my opinion that a book that looks at the early war period in World War II in the Pacific and, wants to set up the battles of Coral Sea and Midway and kind of explain their significance as well as the significance of Pearl Harbor, it seems to me that if a book envisions doing that, envisions telling the early war stories, it needs to do a better and more detailed job. It needs to talk about the attacks on Hong Kong. It does an okay job of the Philippines, but it really just feels rushed. When you look at the amount of detail that goes into Coral Sea, Midway, and Pearl Harbor, it's just kind of mentioned in passing, there was, this operation and Singapore fell, or Java fell without a fight or anything like that. It does do a decent job of talking about I can't speak about the Battle of Java Sea, but overall it just seems to really gloss over the actual combat during that period after Pearl Harbor, but before Coral Sea, where the Japanese saw an unfettered string of successes. And maybe I talked enough about the book to avoid going into it in more detail in the future videos here. But overall, that's the main fault with the book, the lack of discussing the other operations that went on, and really sort of the American-centric look at the early period of World War II, just because the book does kind of claim to be about the whole struggle against Japan from the start of the war to the Battle of Midway. And if your goal is to strictly look at the American side, then I think the book may have done a decent job. But that doesn't seem to be the goal of the book, at least not based on the way that it seems to be set up to me. So I would think there are some areas to improve upon, but overall it's a very entertaining, very good book, very well written, and clear and crisp and to the point. It's a book that, if you don't know a ton about World War II in the Pacific, it can really, teach you kind of how that conflict started and go through some of the early war battles and kind of talk about things. But I don't think, as I already said, that it did a good enough job in setting up the Japanese defeats at Coral Sea and Midway and kind of explaining, it doesn't make you feel like, holy cow, this is a big deal. Which it really was. But anyway, as far as this video is concerned, this just ended up being me ranting a little bit about Pacific Crucible, which I do think is a good book nonetheless. It just it could deal with a few alterations in my eyes, but I'm not a book critic, so what do I know? yeah, in future videos of the series, I may talk more about that or about what's going on. Seems like the Americans in this game really just kind of bull rushed us with their carrier bombers in an attempt to strike some hits and do some damage, but there was no serious damage done thus far, and our fighters are slowly gaining the upper hand. One thing I will say the game needs to do a better job of modeling, and I may have mentioned it in a previous video, is that there doesn't seem to be any chance for critical hits. You know, you get 2 or 3 hit points on a ship, but you don't ever really see, magazine explosion, entire ship lost with 1 bomb hit. That kind of stuff isn't terribly common, but it's still something that happens, and it would be interesting to see it included in the game. But yeah, we're moving on to turn 6 just about, and again, the game does have a total of 30 turns in this battle. Thus far, I believe we've already lost that 1 merchant ship, so we have at least lost 1 merchant ship. There you can see the enemy bombers are coming in and dropping bombs. We've got a lot of cruisers and battleships in the area, though. Hopefully that can provide flak support and make the Japanese less accurate. I had been hoping to park the Japanese aircraft over the top of our aircraft, or our aircraft carriers, to protect them, but it appears the enemy can just bully the planes out of the way and drop the bombs anyway. Still, a more concentrated and cohesive grouping of anti-aircraft fire should help to negate some of the Allied attacks, or at least minimize the damage that they make. With that said, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap this video up. We made it, just shy of 6 turns, 6 full turns. We've still got to do ours here into the game, and made some decent progress, but thus far no real decisions have been made. The American bomber attack appears to be being handled by our forces fairly well, so that we can kind of throw them back and hopefully defend our carrier fleet. I'm not sure what I'll talk about in the next video. I may or may not return to Pacific Crucible. It's an interesting book, but I've kind of talked about it at a high level, and that may be sufficient enough for the site. Additionally, restarting this series will have no impact on the rest of the channel. I'm still working through to get the Operation Glacier videos up and running in a timely manner. I don't want to do just one and then not do any more. The gameplay has slowed down a bit, so we're not racing dramatically ahead of where we were at. So once we do get things going, it should be pretty interesting and pretty consistent. But again, I don't want to race through it before I'm ready to give it its due. This may be the last battle. I'm not really sure if there are more battles after this. If we win Midway, maybe we win the war, or maybe there's like a Pacific invasion and then a West Coast invasion. I'm not sure. I guess we'll find out. But I do want to, kind of return to this series and finish this series off. Finishing off the Commander of the Great War series really has inspired me to want to finish the series that I start. So I am going to kind of return to this series. Also, the fact that there's a DLC coming out for it here in the next couple of weeks certainly didn't hurt my interest in the topic. But I'm not going to, as I said, I'm not going to abandon the other series that I've committed to. Rule the Waves will definitely continue. So will, and I look to have another one of those videos up within the next few days. So will Operation Glacier, which I'm hoping to get off the ground as far as the video series is concerned here very shortly. Maybe a week, maybe 2 tops. And then just other random stuff. I just played a Ultimate General Gettysburg battle against Agrippa Maxentius, another YouTube channel. I'll probably post that either before this video or right after this video, like the day after or something like that. It's not a pretty video. I didn't do great. But anyway, those are kind of my thought processes at this point. And, I think that's really all we have to talk about here today. So I hope you enjoyed my video. I hope you enjoyed kind of some talk about the Pacific Theater in World War II. And let me know what you think of the video. Let me know what you think of kind of my plans going forward. And if you have any, questions or comments, please leave them in the thread, likes or dislikes as well. And again, thanks for watching. And at least for tonight, I'm going to go ahead and try and recover a little bit from the Packers' defeat. I'm a Packers fan, and that was just an abysmal way to exit the playoffs for the 2nd straight year. But anyway, without boring you with that. I appreciate you guys tuning in, and until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for listening and watching, and I'm out.